Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the PixieCast. Ooh, we're late on this one, but hey, what can you do? My name is Connor. I'm also known as the Paranormal Pixie, and this is my podcast, the PixieCast. I don't want to drag this on for too long, so please subscribe to this wherever you are consuming it. And as always, you can find my sources, relevant images, and a recording script on my website, paranormalpixie.com. Benedict Canyon is a unique area of Los Angeles, a winding path through a surprisingly wooded and secluded, canyon in the middle of the city. It has been a popular home for celebrities that want to keep their private life private. The road literally dead ends in Beverly Hills, so it is an incredibly wealthy pocket of LA. So it has had people like Rudolph Valentino, Jimi Hendrix, Timothée Chalamet, and astronaut Katy Perry. It is also a place that hides great tragedies. Within just a few miles of each other are the Manson family's brutal murder of Sharon Tate and her friends, Rock Hudson's tragic death from AIDS, and the infamous Wonderland's murders, which is a whole other episode. It's where Robert Durst killed Susan Berman. So many people have found horrible deaths in Benedict Canyon. I am pretty sure there are more haunted houses than not out there. There is so much to discuss about Benedict Canyon that it is hard to pick a place to start. Then I remembered that there was a new Superman movie coming out, which, using neurodivergent math, brought my mind to the first actor to don the red trunks, George Reeves, who killed himself in the middle of a party. Yes, this is technically two old Hollywood mysterious deaths in a row, but this one is a superhero story, and it has a ghost. It's really different. Also, this is your heads up. We are talking about some pretty heavy stuff today, like suicide, abusive relationships, and we will be getting into some of the grotesque, literally, and sad details of George Reeves' death. So if that's not your bag of tea, it's okay. I completely understand that this is a very difficult subject, but this is your warning. I am not going to give another one. Yes, George Reeves, the first live-action Superman, not to be confused with Christopher Reeve, the next person to don the red shorts, whose tragic horseback riding accident left him almost completely paralyzed. No, today we are talking about George Reeves, the Superman that committed suicide. George's acting career began at the Pasadena Playhouse here in Los Angeles, which is still operational today and recently celebrated its 100th anniversary this year. George eventually landed a bit part in 1939's Gone with the Wind, for which he is incorrectly credited. His career carried on in bit parts and small projects before landing a sizable role in a high-budget, patriotic propaganda movie called So Proudly We Hail in 1943. People will often credit George's role in So Proudly We Hail as his reasons for joining the army that same year, but in reality, Reeves was drafted. He also won't see any combat during World War II. Our Superboy is assigned to the 1st Motion Picture Unit and spends his time in the Army shooting propaganda movies with silly names. George first donned the Superman cape in 1951 for the movie Superman vs. the Mole Men and stayed suited up because they immediately shot a full season of a TV show, Adventures of Superman. The cast contracts were ridiculously restrictive, preventing them from taking on any sort of play, feature film, or any other kind of long-term project. This meant that everybody working on Adventures with Superman was basically trapped in their roles. So they started making public appearances as the characters, turning George into a true Superman. He even stopped smoking in front of the kids and did lots and lots of charity work. Around the same time George became Superman, he found himself in an affair with Toni Mannix, wife of one of the last big Hollywood heavyweights, Eddie Mannix. Eddie is what we call a fixer, meaning he can fix any potentially embarrassing problem for a studio before it hits the papers. Fixers pulled this off by making friends in all the right places. I'm talking about the LAPD, the LA Mafia, doctors, reporters, and also by throwing around a lot of studio cash. Every studio has their fixer. Eddie Mannix is MGM's. George Reeves' relationship with Tony Mannix seems like a more dangerous situation than it is. The Mannixes had what you would call an agreement in their marriage, and both Tony and Eddie had multiple outside romances. Maybe you would call them polyamorous today, but it was definitely an open marriage. Tony would bring George lunches and martinis on the Superman set, to the occasional detriment of the shooting schedule, but hey, when you're the big boss's wife, you get to do that. Tony bought the small house in Benedict Canyon George Reeves will eventually die in. What? You gotta get up. Okay, are you done? Nope. Okay, you're done. Yeah. In 1950, Tony bought George the small Benedict Canyon house he will eventually die in. And the couple would regularly hold barbecues, hangouts, and sing-alongs inside the home. Tony and George's relationship is incredibly close. Everybody that knew them together described them as head over heels in love. If you didn't know that Tony was already married to Eddie Mannix, you'd think that she was Mrs. Reeves. Tony opened up a lot to George. She wanted to learn new things because of him. George was smart, and Tony was a notoriously vapid and shallow woman. But she wanted to learn for him, to communicate with him. Also, he is really hot and super fit for the day. Honestly, George Reeves kind of seems like he was the full package, and he loved Tony too. And he especially enjoyed the lifestyle he was able to maintain as her partner. Expensive clothes, custom cars, fancy dinners, and lots of fun vacations. This is something that George Reeves could never attain on his own. The Adventures of Superman came to an end in 1957. It had a spectacular run. In addition to the show, the cast did stamp PSAs, children-focused talk show appearances, radio bits. Superman even had a fun guest appearance in I Love Lucy, where he saved Lucy's butt by appearing at Little Ricky's birthday party. George had also managed to make a few other bookings in between the restrictive Superman schedule. He was in a Western, a comedy, and a thriller, amongst some other tiny things. However, his role in the iconic movie From Here to Eternity in 1953 ends up being rudely scrapped after test audiences started talking about the Superman cameo and what was supposed to be a very serious film. Still, I hate to call George a washed-up actor. Some people who discuss this case are very quickly to throw that term around, and I find it unfair. Sure, he didn't get any new jobs in the 2 years following Adventures with Superman ending in 1957 and his death in 1959, but that's not abnormal for an actor. Even today, I am simply refusing to call a man with 82 credits to his name a wash-up. So yeah, 2 years go by for George without a major gig. George started to believe that he was only ever going to be Superman. And Superman isn't supposed to grow old. Still, George Reeves had projects in the works. He wasn't wasting away on the couch or losing himself in a never-ending party binge yet. George is an alcoholic. He drinks a lot. It seems like a fish to exist. He's got a really high tolerance, but I wouldn't call it a problem at this point. He toured with his Superman co-stars, doing stage shows and meeting fans. He threw parties at his home with Tony Mannix. He did charity work. He wrote screenplays. And he kept up a workout routine. It is on one of those Superman stage tours that George has a stopover in New York City. While out on town, he meets Lenore Lemon, a socialite, member of the Cafe Society, and certified crazy broad. Lenore is in her mid-30s, on her second scandalous divorce, and rarely sober. But she's also a friend of the Churchills, the Rockefellers, and the Duchess of Windsor. A real wild card of a woman. Immediately, George is smitten by Lenore. And she with him. Tony Mannix? Who's that? George's entire world becomes Lenore Lemon. By the time George told Tony it was over, Lenore was already bags packed and en route to Los Angeles, calling herself Superman's fiancé. Everyone in George's life is shocked by Lenore's sudden appearance and Tony suddenly getting the boot. And even more when he announces their real engagement just a few months later. For the record, George and Tony had been together for over 8 years. Most of George's friends are not fond of Lenore, so they stopped coming around. Lenore loved to be social, though, so she quickly replaced George's Superman family with an assorted band of party-loving lushes that came in and out of their home. Lenore instituted at the house a lights-on policy where if the porch light was on, that meant that the drinks were flowing and anybody was welcome to stop by. And the light was almost always on. If the lull in George's career seemed to add fuel to his heavy drinking problem, it was lit on fire after he met Lenore in December of 1958. Friends who saw Reeves during this time commented that he was rarely seen without a drink on hand or two. One of the officers on the scene of Reeves' death described the kitchen counter like a distillery. We are talking $600 a month alcohol bills in 1959. That is the equivalent of over $6,000 in alcohol a month today. Which Tony Mannix was still paying for, by the way. Even after the split, she just couldn't let him go. And even if it just meant that she was footing the bill. We'll circle back. Jack Larson, the teen who played Jimmy Olsen in Adventures of Superman, and whom George and Tony really were parental figures to, believed that George was heading into a midlife crisis. George just turned 45. The breakup from Tony, the partying, the drinking, the engagement to Lenore, it all just seemed like a temporary spiral to Jack. That one day George would just snap out of it and Tony would take him back. But unfortunately, this spiral is going to find George Reeves dead at the end. Just a little more about what is going on in George Reeves' life before his death. He hit another rocky personal patch, honestly. George's beloved one-eyed dog, Sam, goes missing from George's open-topped car. The car was parked outside of a grocery store, as was their routine, but still nobody saw anything unusual when the dog disappeared. George was absolutely distraught. Sam is one of his best buddies in the whole wide world, and he is just gone. George looks everywhere. He posted signs. He pulled out newspaper ads, but Sam never comes back home. In April of 1959, George had a car accident while driving through the winding roads outside of his house in Benedict Canyon. George lost control of his car and was unable to brake in time to avoid hitting a tree. George technically walked away from the crash, but collapsed at the scene and had to be taken to the hospital. When Reeves' mechanic looked at the damaged car, he noticed that the brake fluid was suspiciously and dangerously low. George could have lost control of that car at any time in the winding Benedict Canyon Road. In a way, he got lucky that he wasn't traveling super fast and that he wasn't far from his home when this happened. But did someone mess with George Reeves' car? What motive would somebody have to try to kill Superman? Then, maybe worst of all, there were the phone calls. Hundreds of them at all hours of the day and night, seemingly at random, never ending, always just breathing on the other end of the phone before an awkward hang up. George changed his number 4 times, but it didn't matter because the calls would just pick right back up again. It was enough to drive anyone insane. It is enough to drive anyone insane. Despite all of this, things were actually starting to look up for George's career as the spring of 1959 rolled around. There were plans to take a Superman tour through Australia later in the year. Then, immediately following that, a new season of Adventures of Superman was supposed to happen. Reeves had also been shopping around a small sci-fi script. He hoped, with the right funding, that he could make his own directorial debut. George Reeves was not happy to reprise his role as Superman. He just turned 45, like I said, and he is starting to show signs of his age. He's growing gray. The physical demands of the job were just becoming more difficult to meet. This wasn't like today with personal trainers and growth hormones. George Reeves donning the Superman cape at 45 in 1959 is not the same as Ben Affleck donning the Batman cowl at 44 in 2016. George has to stay in shape himself, do most of the stunts himself, with only diet, exercise, and martinis. Wait. For this part of the story, we are going to look at it completely at face value, assuming that George Reeves was severely depressed and that all of the little things that we talked about up until this point contributed in his decision to commit suicide. June 15th, 1959, the night of George Reeves' death. It started, like most nights, with a party at his Benedict Canyon home. I didn't. Come here. You want to sit with me? Come here. You're making too much noise. This one, in particular, was to celebrate his and Lenore's upcoming wedding on the 19th. The couple was planning on honeymooning immediately after the nuptials in San Diego. George and Lenore were hanging out with their friends Robert Condon and Carol and Rip Van Ronkel. Yes, those are their real names. They were all hanging out and drinking. Then George and Lenore got bored and left their friends to go out for dinner and drinks. No, seriously, they literally got up and walked out and left their guests sitting there. Granted, Robert Condon is staying there at the guest house, but still, rude. But George and Lenore aren't out for long. They get hammered at a restaurant and start to fight and are eventually asked to leave and go back home. Once back home, the couple continues to drink with their house guest Robert Condon. Around midnight, George gets tired and goes upstairs for bed. Shortly after this, though, Carol Von Ronkel shows back up, along with a man named William Bliss, and the two are ready to party. I am going to quote the entire report filed by Sergeant V.A. Peterson because it's the official story. It's short, he sums it up well, and it's a story that the newspapers run with in the following days. So, this is Peterson's report. At approximately 1:20 a.m., the decedent excused himself as he was going upstairs to bed. Miss Lemon at this time made a statement. He is going to shoot himself. Shortly, they heard the dresser drawer being opened, and Miss Lemon commented, "He is getting the gun out now, and he is going to shoot himself." Moments later, a shot was heard, and Miss Lemon asked Mr. Bliss to go upstairs and see what happened. Mr. Bliss enters the upstairs bedroom and observed the decedent laying nude on his back across the bed. There was a large amount of blood on his body and head, and he went back downstairs to tell the rest of the guests what had happened. Mr. Bliss then called LAPD and on their arrival took them upstairs to the bedroom. There was a .30 caliber German Luger lying on the ground between the decedent's feet. The bullet had passed through the head and lodged in the ceiling of the room. The shell casing was found on the bed under the decedent's body. The bathrobe was lying at the foot of the bed. No notes or messages giving reasons for his actions were found. Witnesses present stated that he was quite despondent about not being able to get the type of acting work that he wanted. The guests were instructed to leave the premises, and the residence was sealed off by the coroner's representatives.
What the fuck? She predicted his death? Looking at George's death scene at the surface level, it just looks like a straight suicide. That's it. But I don't have any crime scene photos from George's death to show you. Not that I would, because I find that grotesque, but also because none were taken by the Los Angeles Police Department. LAPD just took a look at the scene and went, yep, that's a suicide, all right. And took some rather weird statements from some very, very drunk witnesses. And then they called it done. Anyway, without any crime scene photos to go off of, I'm going to try our best to paint us a word picture here. George was found lying partially on his bed, completely naked, with a robe on the ground nearby. He had a gunshot wound to his temple, and he was laying in a massive pool of blood, with the gun perfectly placed between his feet. By partially on the bed, I mean he was flopped on the edge of the bed like his feet were on the floor. So George probably fell back after taking a bullet straight to his head. The bullet lodged in the ceiling above the bed. Nope. That's a suicide. Except the police chief and the coroner responsible for George Reeves' suicide investigation are going to go down completely in 1962 when they both botched the handling of Marilyn Monroe's suicide. I just feel that's a fun little tidbit as we look at what was and wasn't included in the LAPD's investigation of George Reeves' death. There are so many botched elements to the police investigation. Even for a standard suicide, there were things that should have been looked at that weren't. The shell casing for Reeves' suicide shot, you'd expect it to be at his feet with the gun or at least somewhere else on the floor, but LAPD finds the casing underneath George's body, which makes zero sense because if someone was sitting in the position that Reeves was and pulled the trigger on a gun at his temple, the casing would be on the floor. How is it supposed to get underneath him? So I did see one researcher suggest if George was holding it upside down when he shot himself, that might have worked and discharged the bullet to land behind him. We don't know for sure. It wasn't investigated that way. George also left no suicide note, and there was no suicidal language of any kind in George Reeves' writings or in his recent conversations. I know that doesn't mean that he wasn't suicidal. Not everybody shows signs or leaves messages, especially men. And I do firmly believe that George Reeves is depressed as hell. That is not up for argument or even question in my version of this. He is depressed. Reeves' body actually has 3 separate autopsies done at the request of his mother. His mother's name is Helen, and she just might be a bigger drama queen than Lenore. George had this weird, long-distance Norman Bates-esque relationship with his mom, and I am not getting into it here. What's important is that her dedication resulted in this investigation being reopened to be looked at as a homicide and led to an additional 2 extra autopsies, so 3 autopsies total. And here is what we know based off of those 3 autopsies. Reeves' blood alcohol level at the time of his death was 0.27, which is the kind of drunk where you can barely stand up. And he was also taking some pretty heavy painkillers for back problems following that car accident that I mentioned earlier a few weeks prior. George Reeves was fucked up the night of his death. Most people in his condition would have sat glued to the floor or to a toilet bowl in a daze. But George is also an alcoholic on a bender, so his base blood alcohol is high enough to begin with. So there is a chance that he was still very high functioning, even with a 0.27 blood alcohol level. George is also completely nude, which is not a strange thing for him. He's kind of maybe like an early nudist. The man loved to be naked. He worked out naked. He made his drinks naked. He did his barbecuing naked. He was one of those people. But it is very strange for a suicide to be naked, no matter how much the person enjoyed wandering around in their birthday suit while they were alive. In addition, the gun at Reeves' feet was neatly cleaned and oiled down with 0 fingerprints on it, just little smudges. George Reeves' hands were never tested for powder residue or to see if the oil matched his hands, so it was never confirmed if he fired the gun or not. In fact, nobody in this Benedict Canyon house this night is going to be tested for gun residue. At no point in any of the autopsies did the coroners test the bullet entry point for gunpowder residue. This would see if the gun was up against George's head when it was fired or if it was at a distance. Even though 2 of those investigations were done to see if it was a murder. On a return visit to the Benedict Canyon house, V.A. Anderson pulled back the carpet in the attic bedroom and found 2 additional bullet holes in the floor, both of which are fired from that same .30 caliber gun used to kill George Reeves and made it through the floorboards into the first floor. Both landed harmlessly in not dangerous spots. The witnesses that night only reported hearing a single gunshot. Were they lying or were they confused? After all, they were pretty freaking drunk that night. But then these 2 holes were hidden under a rug. So how did they get there and at what point were they covered up? 3 of the witnesses present, Carol Von Ronkel, Robert Condon, and William Bliss, will never be interviewed by the LAPD after this first night. Not even when the case is reopened and investigated as a homicide by LAPD. Not even when it was revealed that nobody really knew William Bliss that well or remembered inviting him over that night. The only person that is going to be interviewed by LAPD again is Lenore Lemon, and she is called, and I mean a real call, because Lenore skips town and cheeses it back to New York City to go hide with her mom just a few days after George's death. The detectives that called Lenore asked about the 2 bullet holes in the floor, and Lenore confessed to making one of them, saying that a few weeks prior, she asked George if she could fire the .30 caliber gun to hear what it sounded like. And for some insane reason, she fired it inside the house. Lenore only admits to making one of the bullet holes and does not mention if the other one was from George firing the gun, and she wasn't pressed further on it. This still leaves us 1 unaccounted bullet fired from the .30 caliber gun. Oh, and the name on the gun registration? Eddie Franken Mannix. But there is one more odd part about the night that cannot be ignored. Phyllis Cotes, the original Lois Lane and a rare friend-ish of Tony Mannix, said that the night of George Reeves' suicide, she received a panicked phone call from Tony at around 4 a.m. This would be in the early morning of June 16th, 1959. "The boy is dead. He's been murdered," Tony shrieked into the phone. Phyllis turned pale as a sheet. The boy was Tony's nickname for George Reeves. She knew in her gut that Superman was dead. But how did Tony know that Reeves was dead? The police are still at his house at this point. They haven't even finished submitting their reports yet. Even if Tony was able to get some kind of insider information about George's death from a police contact or something, they were under the impression that he committed suicide. What reason would Tony Mannix have to think that George was murdered? Okay, so here's the deal. When I started my research, I thought the conclusion that I'd come to was either that it was an actual suicide or that Lenore did it and had her friends help her cover it up. I assumed she probably killed George by accident, but she still covered it up as a suicide to save her own butt. In one interview she gave with a reporter just a few days after Reeves' death, I think she let her ego and mask slip enough to show a murder motive. She says, quote, "He wanted to bring me the moon and diamonds and moonbeams, and he just couldn't do it because he just couldn't get a job." Ugh. It's terrible, but it's true. When a celebrity of any degree dies, people take notice. And being the fiance, the grieving fiance, was a good way to get your name in the paper and some extra sympathy. From the moment police arrived, Lenore started explaining how upset George was over his career, that even their love was not enough to fill the void of his acting passion. I think it's clear that Lenore wanted a lifestyle that George Reeves could not reasonably afford. George's life, even with Lenore in it, was still mostly funded by Tony and George's mom. Superman's residual deal was crap, and again, it's been a minute since George had a real acting role. But there was a will, and if Lenore was named George Reeves' beneficiary, oh, whatever money he did have to his name, which ends up being around $25,000, which is almost $300,000 today. The Superman residuals, the house in Benedict Canyon, all of that would go to Lenore. Lenore skips town back to New York City a few days after George's death. She hires herself a fancy lawyer and gave the interview that I quoted just a second ago while she waited to hear about the will. The evidence stacked up against Lenore is also interesting. I already went over her potential motive for killing George, but let's look at how she might have pulled it off. Millicent Trent, the designer of the Creature of the Black Lagoon costume, stick with me here, heard quite the juicy tale when talking to William Bliss one day. Allegedly, the night of George Reeves' death, Reeves and Lenore argued upstairs after Bliss and Carol von Ronkel arrived so late. During a brief window, when Robert Condon was out of the room getting a drink, everybody in the house heard a gunshot ring out. Lenore then rushes downstairs, frantic, asking William Bliss and Carol von Ronkel to please tell them I was down here. Tell them I was down here. Years later, in 1989, during the final months of her life, Lenore Lemon gives one last interview where she provided some new information about the night of George Reeves' death. First, both Robert Condon and Carol von Ronkel were already in Reeves' Benedict Canyon house when Lenore and Reeves returned from dinner. Carol had snuck back into the house in her nightie for a little tryst with Robert Condon. This makes William Bliss's appearance super weird. Again, he is a neighbor, And they do have a lights on policy, so it is, drinks are flowing. But he's not a frequent member of their circle. He's not somebody that anybody knows very well. It's just odd. She also adjusts the night's timeline by revealing that William Bliss first called a friend in the Beverly Hills Police Department who came up, assessed the scene, and was like, yeah, this ain't my jurisdiction. You're going to need to call LAPD. This is valuable time spent between George's death and the actual police arriving. Time that could easily have been spent getting a story together. She also reveals that Carol von Ronkel was obviously embarrassed to be caught half naked at her dead friend's house, suicide or not. So Lenore got the crazy idea to call her bestie, Gwen Daly, and have Gwen pose as Carol for the LAPD so the real Carol can go home. So Lenore brings in an even closer friend to help her cover this up. So using this new information, here is how I believe Lenore killed George Reeves and covered it up. So we now know that Carol and Robert were already in the house and occupied. It is safe to say that everybody is then woken up by William Bliss's arrival. Lenore and the others go downstairs to start the party back up again, but George is angry at the late guests and came downstairs to complain. It's a big day tomorrow. They're headed down to San Diego. Lenore started to argue with George, and the two took it upstairs. In the course of their argument, Lenore grabs the gun that is always kept on the dresser and takes a shot at George. She misses, and the bullet goes through the floor. Maybe they physically fought, but whatever happens, the second bullet then hits George in the head, and he falls back onto the bed. In the course of their argument, Lenore grabs the gun on the dresser and takes a shot at George. She misses, and the bullet lands through the floor. Maybe they physically fought for a brief moment, but whatever happened after that, the second bullet hits George in the head, and he falls back onto the bed. Lenore then turns around, runs downstairs, looks, and realizes that Robert Condon is out of the room. She then takes this chance to ask William Bliss and Carol von Ronkel to tell them I was down here. When Robert Condon walks back into the room, Lenore says the first thing that comes to her mind as a possible excuse. George Reeves was depressed and killed himself. William Bliss heads upstairs to confirm that Superman is in fact dead, and then he calls his friends at the Beverly Hills Police Department. In this particular moment, in this situation, I can write off William Bliss calling the Beverly Hills cops because I doubt he realized that he was out of Beverly Hills jurisdiction. But during this time, since Carol von Ronkel got cold feet about lying to the cops, but the Beverly Hills cop already knew that there was a second woman there. And so a second woman had to be present when LAPD arrived, or else it would be suspicious if anybody asked questions. So this is when Lenore decides to call Gwen Daly, who is going to be a much better confidant and more likely to lie. Everybody toes the party line, and poor Robert Condon is the unwitting pawn there to confirm everybody's story blindly by accident. There it is, a possible murder and a brilliant cover-up. Not that any of it mattered, because George Reeves never updated his will. In the end, all of his assets went to Tony Maddox, who distributed all to charities. Just like that, it all slipped through Lenore's hands. A lot of people in this case say that Eddie Maddox may have ordered George Reeves' murder. And I mean, the gun is registered in his name. Still, I do not think that Eddie Maddox had George killed. Eddie was really sick and barely made it out of the home anymore, and the Maddoxes had an arrangement. I don't see him suddenly getting jealous at this point. Like it's been too long to really have those feelings. And I don't see him ordering George's death at Tony's request either, because she is clearly fucked up over this breakup. And I doubt that Eddie is going to be willing to play along with that insanity. Plus, you'd be killing Superman. And say what you will about George being washed up actor or whatever, but very few kids in America did not know George Reeves' face. However, that still leaves the possibility of Toni Mannix ordering the killing of George Reeves herself in a fit of passion. For my research, I always obtain at least one physical book on every topic if possible, not necessarily to use as my primary source by any means. I just like having that something that's not digital, even though honestly by this day and age digital research is much more fertile. But no, I like to have a hard copy. Smell the book, hear the book. This time, I got my hands on Hollywood Kryptonite by Sam Kashner and Nancy Schoenberger. See that? There we go. This is published in 1996, and in it, they lay out the possibility that I had never considered. Toni Mannix was directly involved in George Reeves' death. Toni, it seems likely, became a stalker after George dumped her. She just could not let him go. Remember how George Reeves' one-eyed pooch Sam disappeared? Around that same time, Toni's friend Constance got a call. Toni always seemed to be calling someone to whine about George or complain about Lenore. In the background of this particular call, though, Constance heard the unmistakable sound of a small dog barking. Wait, did Toni snatch her ex's dog just to spite him? Did someone have an animal over at the Mannixes? They weren't the type to keep pets on their own. One thing we do know for sure Toni Mannix was responsible for was the phone calls. Because Toni hired her groundskeeper, Santiago, to call Reeves' Benedict Canyon house at all hours of the day and night, so that they wouldn't be traced back to her house. This calls into question his April car accident then. The brake fluid was really low. Could Toni have had somebody mess with George's brake line? This confusion and, paranoia is accurate paranoia. George and Lenore were ready to get away from it all. They knew that Toni was responsible for the harassment in their guts, and they hoped that giving her some space would maybe help, which is why they were leaving for San Diego the next day to get married. And they had decided to change all of the locks before leaving. This was truly going to be a start of a new chapter in George Reeves' life, one without Toni Mannix in it. We're back. I changed because who needs continuity? Anyway, we're filming this the next day, and I'm going to try to crank things out because it is hot today here in Los Angeles. Anyway, here we go. During the process of changing those locks, the guy realized that he didn't bring enough locks, or I have no idea how to rekey a house. So whatever it was, he says he didn't bring enough. And so he suddenly took off with the promise to return the next day and finish the job. The only door left unchanged was the door leading from the pool into the house. Convenient. Toni Mannix, brokenhearted and driven to madness, knew that the night of June 15th, 1959 would be her last chance at George before he was totally Lenore's. In a fit of anger, Toni calls up one of Eddie's buddies and tells him exactly how to kill Superman. She knew about George's gun, because she gave it to him, and she even knew where he kept it, because it was right there on his nightstand. If everything was done right, the death could be pinned on Lenore in a moment of rage. Because if Tony couldn't have George, nobody could have him. Hell hath no fury like a jilted rich white person, huh? Tony's vengeance would sneak its way into the Benedict Canyon house through the back door, which again had not been rekeyed yet. Creep up the stairs to the bedroom, past the very drunk Lenore and her friends, to find George Reeves naked laying down in bed. The assassin found the gun right where Tony said it would, on the nightstand, held up the gun, steadied, and George started to wake up and then stand up. So there are two ways this next part can go. Either one, the gunman assesses the situation fast, grabs Reeves as he sets up, and shoots point blank into his head before George has any idea what's happening. Option 2 is Reeves and the gunman briefly tussle. The gun discharges a shot into the floor before the assassin regains control, pushes George back onto the bed, and shoots him in the head. There's an optional option that maybe George was really wearing his robe and it fell off during the encounter. That one sounds just kind of fun, bringing it up because it's funny. Still, there are two unanswered questions about this theory, at least for me. Number one of them is William Bliss. Is he a part of this plan? Is he supposed to be distracting Lenore and his friends while the real killer slipped up into the back? William Bliss is the first person to run upstairs and see George's dead body. Did he help stage the scene as a suicide in that moment? Again, nobody remembers inviting William Bliss over to the party, and nobody knows him all that well to begin with. Also, and this is something that is very unique to LA. I mean, maybe New York has the same thing, but this is LA. And sometimes a random person just shows up to your house, especially if you're having a multi-day party. It's just the way of LA. The person shows up, you have no idea who he is, everybody parties together, they have a great time, and then the person leaves and you never see them again and there's no explanation. That's just LA. So William Bliss could just be one of those kind of people. Finally, the other piece that doesn't add up for me is that the locks on the back door. Is the locksmith paid to leave the back door unchanged? Did Tony intentionally arrange it that way? Or did the assassin just get lucky that their intended entrance was the only available option? At this point in my research, I have no fucking clue. To me, there are three theories to explain George Reeves' death, and I honestly have no idea which one to believe. Did he actually kill himself? Was he murdered in a moment of passion by Lenore? Was Tony Mannix out to get him for breaking up with her? I have no idea. This feels to me like the opposite of the last couple episodes that I had, where I came at you with a theory and then immediately just proved it as I went through it. I just feel like I added the mystery for myself, at least. So what did you think? Did George Reeves commit suicide, or was he the victim of one of the women in his life? Because seriously, I can't decide. But I promised you ghosts. So here we go. The Benedict Canyon home where George Reeves died still stands today, and it has had a rotating group of renters and owners over the past 60 plus years of death. None of them seem to stay long, and many of them have had the same ghostly encounters. Hearing the sounds of a party downstairs late at night and waking up to the frightening sound of gunshots and the smell of sulfur in the bedroom. Some people even report seeing a stark naked George Reeves standing there in his former bedroom. Eventually, the house's new residents move out, and the legend continues with the next people that move in. Is George trying to give us a hint from his afterlife about his killer? Is this a matter of his tragic spirit being trapped in the house, unable to process his suicide and move on? I tend to lead towards more of the memory of George lingering, the memory of his final party and his final moments that linger in the house. One thing is for sure, if George Reeves needs me to solve the case around his death, he'd be fresh out of luck because I truly have no idea and I want to hear what you think. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I love you all. I hope you learned something new and weird today listening to this podcast. I hope whatever you were working on while you were listening to this turned out really well, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.